So as many of you are aware, the WIPP was recertified a few months ago in July, and that was the culmination of an effort. It took about 4 years or so from when the DOE first started putting together the application to when it was we were finally recertified by the EPA. And what that means, that recertification means that the EPA determined that the WIPP was in compliance with the EPA regulations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that process and focus in on 3 sensitivity studies that were done to support that decision-making process. I'll just point out that, to be clear, those sensitivity studies were requested by the EPA during their review of the application. They made the request to DOE. Sandia, as the scientific advisor to DOE on this project, then performed those performance assessments, sensitivity studies. First, a little bit of background. The WIPP is located about 5 hours drive from here, depending upon how fast you drive.
The audio is not working on the WebEx?
Okay, so the WIPP is located in southeast New Mexico, and in that little green area, and which means we're in bedded salt. So Peter mentioned WIPP a few times during his talk, but a little bit more background. It is the only licensed deep geologic repository for nuclear waste in the U.S., and we store or dispose of transuranic waste there in embedded salt. The EPA is the regulator for the long-term performance, right? DOE operates it, EPA does that regulation for the long-term performance. And Sandia supports the DOE in doing performance assessments that look at that long-term performance. And our requirements come from the EPA regulations in terms of how we do the PA. The important things, a few important things, are that that PA must give a reasonable expectation that our cumulative releases over the 10,000 years, only 10,000 years, not a million years, so fairly short period of time, and that we include all significant processes and events, and it must be in compliance with some release limits that are specified by the EPA regulations. So dig into that a little bit. The reasonable expectation terminology acknowledges that there are uncertainties, right? And that's why we work in this probabilistic framework for doing our PAs. And we take those uncertainties into account through, well, there's a stochastic part of the calculations, the unknown future events, how often, when someone drills into the WIPP, that's uncertain as to how often that happens, when that happens. And we also take those uncertainties into account through parameter distributions. So we sample distributions for many of the parameters. And the last bullet point down there, we include significant processes and events. Really the events that are most impactful are the human intrusion events. So as Peter mentioned, that low permeability of the salt really keeps radionuclides in there long term. And so the radionuclides don't really come out. We don't predict them to come out unless there's human intrusion involved, and that's part of the regulations that we must include that potential there. On the right side, I just want to point out, you can't read that. It's from 40 CFR 191. Peter also mentioned briefly, but the releases here, Peter showed dose over time, and that's not really what we deal with, right? So we're just dealing with the cumulative releases, so that time is taken into account. We'll show you what our curves look like here in a minute, but our releases aren't dose either. So there's that normalization that Peter mentioned as well, which has some interesting implications. But each radionuclide has or different radionuclides have different release limits. That all gets taken into account in that equation down there. And the total inventory is used as a normalization as well. So WIPP covers about 24 conceptual models, and there's a code framework, consists of 10 principal codes and a number of other utility codes. So there are run-in sequence, the output of some feed into as input into others, and that's just sort of a map, a schematic of how those interact. Real quickly, the release mechanisms that we take into account at WIPP include releases to what we call the accessible environment, which includes the laterally to the land withdrawal boundary and also to the ground surface. So I mentioned earlier that you can have releases through a drilling event. So that's that purple drill rig there that can drill through potentially the waste area in yellow there and potentially into a pressurized brine source below the repository. There's also potential for releases to come out laterally through higher permeability features. So our compliance curve looks like this, where on the bottom we've got release in those EPA units. I just showed a couple slides ago how we calculate those EPA units. Again, we're not dealing with dose. And then on the y-axis, we're dealing with probability. As long as we are to the left of the dashed line there, which shows the EPA release limits, then we're showing our calculations show that we're in compliance. And we can break that total release curve down into individual release mechanisms, the impact from individual release mechanisms to see which ones dominate. So typically at the higher probability, lower consequence releases, that's that brown curve there, the cuttings and cavings, where you actually are solid releases from drilling into the waste itself. And then that blue one that kind of kicks out towards the higher releases, lower probability, are the DBRs, the direct brine releases. So the solubilized radionuclides come to the surface following a drilling intrusion. So on to the recertification process. Every 5 years since the waste was first shipped to WIPP in 1999, the DOE submits an application to the to the EPA. So any year ending in 9 or 4, we're going to be sending, or the DOE is going to be sending what we call a CRA, or a compliance recertification application. And that typically, or today is always included a performance assessment, so a PA, that deals with what I just went over in the last few slides. So the last one was submitted in 2014 and included a number of changes from the previous baseline in 2009. And again, just in July, there was a recertification by the EPA. So a little bit of timeline on, I mentioned earlier, this is a long process. So the DOE and Sandia as the advisor to the DOE started putting together that application in 2012, preparing, so that's starting on the left there on the timeline, preparing for the PA calculations, which are relatively short compared to everything else here, that yellow box there. And then there's the documentation, right? So we go through quite extensive documentation and review at different levels, so all the way up to DOE headquarters review. Submittal in early 2014. And at that point, the EPA starts to take a look at what's been submitted in the application. And they had a number of questions. They submit those questions to the DOE, and DOE responds. And we went through a few rounds of that. And in that comment response period, the EPA also made some requests of the DOE for sensitivity studies. So those were additional PA calculations that looked at changing some parameters that they wanted to see what the impact would be to changing some parameters. So some what-if calculations on that initial PA that we submitted. So that extended out to the end of last year. They made a completeness determination early this year, and then finally the recertification. And there were a few technical exchanges along the way. So as the EPA was reviewing the application, there's interaction between the DOE and EPA, and Sandia was part of that as well. So on to the sensitivity studies themselves. So to be clear, these were EPA directed, so these were parameters that the EPA mandated that we use. So it's not a compliance calculation, it wasn't a new baseline. Again, they're kind of these what-if calculations. And again, the EPA directed those to the DOE do those, and Sandia went ahead and we did those calculations and analyzed the results, submitted those back through DOE to the EPA. So there were 3 sensitivity studies that were officially done and submitted back, and they're sent, we call them CRA-14, Send 2, 3, and 4. Send 1 we don't talk about. I won't get into why they're called Send 2, 3, and 4, but there's some back and forth in terms of the parameter. I said they're EPA mandated parameters. There's some back and forth in terms of what's possible to implement. Not all parameters are compatible with each other, so there's some of that went on in Send 1. By the time we got to Send 2, by the time we got to a full set of parameters that were really compatible, they changed a lot from where we had started, so we called that Send 2. On the left on the right there's a diagram, top view of the schematic of the WIPP. In the middle, in the green, is the operations area. That's where you'd come, if you go into the repository, you come down into the operations area. To the north, there's the experimental area, and to the south, there are waste panels. I'll also point out those little black segments in the waste panels are panel closures, and those will come up here in a little bit. Those separate the panels from each other and kind of have a dual purpose. During the operations phase, they keep, they separate the waste from the workers. Long term, there's some impact on releases as well, keeping the panels separate. Send 2 focused on parameters in the operations and experimental areas. Send 3 used those same parameters, but then added on some changes to parameters in the panel closures. And then Send 4 didn't have anything to do with Send 2 or Send 3, but it's kind of a mishmash of a bunch of different parameters that the EPA wanted to see the impact of changing. So Send 2, so I've quoted here the rationale. So and it's for clarity, and so I'm not misrepresenting the intent of those, because again, this came from the EPA, so I'll use their terminology or their rationale for excuse me, why the sensitivity studies were performed. And that was to look at the non-waste areas, so the operations and experimental areas. And the what if we assumed that these creep closed immediately as soon as you close the door on the WIPP, that we had essentially solid salt in the operations and experimental area. So we know that it creeps closed over time, but if we assume that it's, there's some uncertainty in that. So typically we assume the porosity there is a constant 18%. So that's kind of an average number that's been used forever in WIPP-PA that sort of takes into account, okay, we start out, at time 0 about 100%, right? Nothing's creeped in yet, and by 10,000 years it's creeped to some not exactly known amount. So we use about 18%, and the EPA was interested in, well, what if that closes immediately and the porosity is really low and the permeability is really low? I think part of the rationale is that those areas can act as a sink, a gas sink, during the regulatory period. So it's a lot of volume that can sort of accept gas that's being generated in the waste panels. So the pressure is kind of a pressure relief for the gas that's generated in the waste panels. The gas is generated in the waste panels from corrosion of the metal canisters, as well as the microbial degradation of plastics. So the idea is that we may be missing some higher pressure reality by having an open operations and experimental areas. So we closed those down immediately, and we did see increased pressures. I don't have a plot of that here, but we did see increased pressures and saturations in the operations experimental areas. We saw increased pressures in the waste areas. Brine saturations decreased a little bit on average. There was that decreased flow of gas towards the north as we expected, right? We've got this big barrier there. So taking all that into account, there's really very insignificant increase in releases. So there's actually two curves there on the right. The red curve are the SEN2 results, and they lie pretty much on top of the CRA-14 results. So they're like I said, in terms of pressure and saturations, there was impact for those parameter changes, but ultimately on the releases, there wasn't much of a change. SEN3, again, looked at those same kind of types of changes to the experimental operations areas, but also the panel closures. So currently, we assume those panel closures close up with time a little bit. And the what if is, if those closed immediately, basically to solid salt, what would be the impact? So that the pressures in those waste panels would potentially increase. And we did see some of that as we kind of expected, but again, there wasn't really a big impact on the results. So, when we get down to releases, there wasn't very much of an impact. Minor increase. So there's a little bit, you can see out to the right, that blue curve pushes out a little bit to the right for those sort of higher releases, low probability releases. So then we got to SEN4, and there were a number of parameters that the EPA had issues with, and again, we discussed those during the technical exchanges, but ultimately we were handed some parameters to test out. On the right there, we see some solubilities that they wanted changed. So for the +3 actinides, there was a push to the right, so higher solubilities. And for the +4 actinides, there's actually to the left a little bit, and that was due to inclusion of some different what's the right word? Published literature, basically. We included some literature. There's some discussion about what was relevant to WIPP and what wasn't. So after going through those calculations, those are the new solubilities. There's a couple of minor errors that we found during the review process, so those were included as well. And the one other big parameter change was the probability of intersecting brine. So if you think back to that schematic I showed, there's a potential that a drilling intrusion that goes through the repository could intersect pressurized brine below it. And so obviously there's quite a bit of uncertainty as to the extent of and the amount or the extent of the where you'd find brine below. It's not 100%. There's some probability of hitting brine below the repository, and typically we've used so with that uncertainty we've used a range of about 1 to 60%, and we sample that range for different realizations. For CRA-14, the DOE proposed a new distribution based on drilling data around the WIPP, so that the original distribution was based off of some geophysical data that was site-specific, so right over where the panels are, but at the ground surface. So the DOE, Sandia, thought that drill data from around the WIPP would be able to reduce the uncertainty in those values, and we came up with a probability distribution that's the black line on in that plot there. So we said about, we're closer to 10 to maybe 20% probability of hitting brine, nothing close to 60%. But the EPA didn't really like that, so they came back with a reassessment of that original geophysical data. They came up with a new distribution, and that's the red one over there. So it pushes us to higher probabilities, which increases direct brine releases. And overall, there was a significant increase in all the release mechanisms and the overall releases as well, when you take into account all the changes that were introduced into the SEN4 sensitivity study. So the summary of the sensitivity studies, these are all quotes from the EPA in their federal, or the technical support documents that came along with the Federal Register notice. So they use these sensitivity studies in their decision-making process for the determination of compliance, and that the sensitivity studies broadly addressed many of their technical concerns and showed a reasonable expectation that terminology we talked about earlier, that the repository will continue to comply with EPA regulations. But that final bullet says there's still some technical issues that weren't addressed. So just a quick summary. Again, we just went over how PA is done, or why it's done, and talked about those sensitivity studies. And I wanted to thank Brad Day, who's a member of the WIPP PA team, for his extensive work on the sensitivity studies. So thank you.
Thank you. Peter Swift, Sandia. Todd, for drilling data on brine, where brine is and isn't, is that something that the oil industry reports routinely, whether or not they hit brine in the Castile? What fraction of the total number of holes out there do you actually have records from?
So that's a good question. I don't know that they're required to, but I know that they do. The current technology is such that they can detect a really small amount, and they can shut it down as soon as they can detect a barrel or two of brine, based on what they're expecting, and everything is going into a controlled, how do they call it, controlled pit now. It's not an open pit, so they know when their volume is exceeded. But I think that's, you bring up a good issue, and I think that's part of what the EPA was kind of concerned with is, well, how well do we know, that they are reporting everything? But in terms of, we've got 600 some holes, and a handful show brine release, but and recent trends are showing less and less. So maybe there's something to investigate there.